Thank you so much, Neena and Jeff. Thank you all for coming today. So, I'm Jeff McGee from the Bill Lane Center for the American West. Once upon a time, I was a Knight Fellow when Dawn and Jim Bettinger were running the show, and I'm very glad to be here. This is my umpteenth Knight-Risser Symposium, and I've been very glad to be part of this. This is the year that I pulled a Cheney and I nominated myself to be the moderator, so we'll find out if that was a terrible idea or just a questionable idea. Let me reintroduce the panel. You've met them so far to some extent. David Kennedy, thank you for starting off on that. So Neena is with Texas Tribune, and Jeff from ProPublica. Now, our other panelists, Cheryl Phillips was at the Seattle Times and is, was at the Seattle Times. And she's a founding member of the Stanford Computational Journalism Lab since she arrived at Stanford in 2014. And she's involved in a cross-departmental effort to collect police interaction data and evaluate racial disparities. This is called the Stanford Open Policing Project, and we're going to maybe get to talk about that a little bit. She's also a member of the California Civic Data Coalition, and we'll find out more about that. But basically, it's about sharing election and campaign funding data, really. She's also deeply involved in Investigative Reporters and Editors, which is a grassroots training organization for journalists, and she's former board president. And so she's deeply involved in the data journalism and investigative journalism community, and is also really pushing the boundaries of the craft, even as she has now entered in a more academic context. David Hayes, as David Kennedy mentioned, is a member of the Bill Lane Center Advisory Council, and it's been a real pleasure getting to know him as he's been at Stanford since 2013, I think, since leaving the Obama administration. He did 2 tours of duty as the Deputy Secretary of Interior under Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. When you are the Deputy Secretary of Interior, you run the Bureau of Land Management. You have management authority over 70,000 employees, a $14 billion budget, and 10 major bureaus and agencies. And David was very involved in climate change planning while in the administration, and then he's going to be moving on to a new assignment at NYU that I think we'll get the chance to talk about as well. So I've got a few slides here that I want to... So Hurricane Harvey was a catastrophe and a season of catastrophes. We had 12 years without a single Category 4 or 5 hurricane touching down on the U.S., but this last summer and fall, we saw 6 major hurricanes, and they collectively devastated communities all around the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. As Hurricane Irma closed in, South Florida saw one of the largest evacuations in U.S. history, and we know Hurricane Maria devastated the islands of Dominica, Puerto Rico, and others. And even wild Hurricane Ophelia, who crossed the Atlantic and struck Ireland, Norway, and Estonia before petering out in Russia. Petering out, yeah. And it's not necessarily over yet, because officially speaking, hurricane season lasts until November 30th. Here's a look at the tracks of all the big hurricanes this year. It's also not over because at this point, Puerto Rico, almost 2 months after Maria, is still missing half of its electric power generation. This is this is taken today from the Washington Post. Apologies, Jeff, for all the Washington Post graphics you're going to see.
All right.
So, Inside Climate News recently published an article, actually this is the end of September, maybe the number's gone up, estimating that the collective cost of the hurricanes and the Northern California wildfires is in the neighborhood of $300 billion. So the question is, who saw this coming? And that's why we're here. In March 2016, it was 18 months before the landfall of Hurricane Harvey, and that's when Texas Tribune and ProPublica released their report. And I have to say, I'm not very proud of this reaction, but when the judges announced that Hell and High Water was the winner of the 2017 Knight-Risser Prize, I thought, well, this is a fantastic project. But it still happened. And, I think we can all agree that's a pretty unfair reaction, because what's wrong with Houston is going to take a long, long time to fix. For example, the question of the Ike Dike or a seawall, it could be 2024 before anyone starts working on that. I know I'm going to need to talk across the mic a little better. And that wouldn't even solve the drainage problems that made Harvey so devastating. So here's, that made Harvey so bad. The storm dumped 50 inches of rain, that cumulatively 19 trillion gallons of water, which, if you ever wondered what it looked like as a cube, wonder no longer, on a very heavily paved urban area. Houston is the nation's 4th most populous city, but it's so sprawling that, according to Sunday's New York Times, it encompasses a land area larger than Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, and Philadelphia combined. Land area, that is. So here's 2001 footprint, and here's 2011. That's just that's a decade there. And I imagine it's continued since then. So you'll get your panel back, guys, sorry. Regardless of these challenges, hell and high water did affect change, and right away. Within a month, the state had legislation to speed up the a response. Senator John Cornyn introduced a bill in the Senate, the U.S. Senate, in April 2016, a month later. And in December of last year, President Obama signed a bill that funded further research, and we'll find out more about that. So I guess my first question to Neena is, where do things stand right now with Houston? It almost feels like, after all of the catastrophes that have happened since Harvey, that we've become a little bit unglued from the story there. So how are the people in Houston doing, and what has started to happen in terms of making it better?
Yeah, well, I just want to start off, love those graphics, but you can also find a lot of very similar ones in our Boomtown Floodtown project, which Al Shaw worked on, so check it out.
Here it is.
It's uncanny.
But unfortunately, we didn't.
No. So what's happened since Harvey? There are so many big infrastructure issues, flooding infrastructure issues in Houston. I think the big question is going to be which one is going to be addressed. I'm maybe a pessimist in thinking it's not going to be all of them. Recently, Texas submitted a request, or announced that they were going to submit a request, I believe, then they did actually submit it, for $60 billion of federal money to address a number of issues. And some of that included, there was something in there, it was $6 billion for something that has nothing to do with hell and high water, but was very much addressed in our follow-up project. And it's for non-structural, so not even infrastructure, addressing non-structural issues with the Addicks and Barker reservoirs. If any of you have heard of those are these two kind of unique flood control projects west of Houston that are have many, many problems, which I won't go into here. So $6 billion just to address non-structural issues. So that just gives you a sense of, when you get to the structural issues, you're talking tens of billions. So I really think we still don't know, no money has been allocated for anything that large, structural or non-structural. I think we're still arguing over how much money for short-term recovery. It's not great so far. Texas leaders who in the past have not really liked meddling from the federal government are now saying, hey, we need more help from you, we need more money. And our Governor Greg Abbott has gotten into fights with the Texas congressman, which is kind of a new thing, I think, politically. So I don't really know exactly how much money is going to be allocated. I don't think anybody knows. I think obviously the fact that Irma happened, Puerto Rico, those are competing priorities. But the reality is right now Houston has competing priorities. There are projects that are competing for each other for funding in Houston. So it's not a great situation. But I do think that more and more people are aware, and you have the mayor of Houston now saying we need money, along with all these other things. We need money to build the coastal spine, not just for the Addicks and Barker Reservoir. So that's a good sign, because they've got to ask for the money if it's going to be allocated. And before they weren't even asking, and now they're asking.
I think that's a good point you make there about the follow-up series, Boomtown, Floodtown, because as Jim Risser said, you not only get one told you so, you get two. Because the flood vulnerability story came out in December of last year, and it really focused on the fact that Houston had been flooding repeatedly already, regardless of the fact that there weren't any major hurricanes landing since 2008 or so.
Right.
And so you guys really get the prize for sounding the warning bell here. And I want to think about that concept, like you're trying to wake people up to a threat, and this report does that very effectively. But to the extent that we're talking about a warning bell and playing a role as journalists in trying to alert people, let's talk about the format of that alert. This is it has a very rich narrative written story, but the heart of it is this interactive simulation, and it's inside what we would call a news application, right? So can you tell us what a news application is and why that seemed to be the best format for getting this message across? And that's to both of you guys.
Yeah, so the way that we think of news applications at ProPublica is they're sort of interactive databases that anybody can go and find, sort of see the larger story, but also find their own specific story. So in this example, what Neena was talking about, that you can, if you live in Houston, you can find out what these computer models say is going to happen if a hurricane comes to your house or your address, is very important, is sometimes as important as the story that is a nationwide thing. And especially when we have a local partner. We do news applications over and over and over again on things like Louisiana flooding, from things like Louisiana flooding all the way to how much are doctors taking from pharmaceutical companies, right? Both nationwide and individual doctors. So someone can be informed when they look up their doctor. For this one, it was very clear. Al has this book that is all ratty and tattered now because he's been thumbing through it so long, but it was very clear when we saw these rainbow maps that, like, if we had the data behind it, we could do something fantastic. There's something visceral about seeing, even on a scale like this, even on your computer screen, that's clearly a simulation of seeing the water coming for people's homes. So it was really clear to us that we wanted to do a big, huge graphical treatment of this thing.
So in terms of your plan for impact, like how you were gonna move the needle in terms of public policy or public attitudes towards this, I want to ask about your publications and how they, their relationships with their communities. I think of the Tribune as being a very politically wired publication. It's in Austin, it's in the capital. It's well read among people who are, well, I'm going to say something patronizing, so I won't say it. It's well read among people who are close to government and policy.
Mm-hmm.
ProPublica is very prominent and very successful and won a number of Pulitzers. There's not really a mass market website so much, right? Like, so what is your idea of how you create? I don't want to say create a movement, but how you create impact for your stories?
Well, I think in this example, when we published, we had an event in Houston.
Right.
I mean, I wasn't there, so.
Yeah, and it was actually one of the things that the Texas Tribune does, I think, really well outside of our journalism is events. This was a pretty unique one. We tend to have a panel of usually politicians or local politicians or state politicians that go up, and our CEO and my boss, Evan Smith, asked them very hard questions. In this case, we wanted to do something a little different. We had a group of stakeholders up there in Houston, some local politicians, I believe a scientist, some people from the business community talking about this. And it was very well attended. I believe there were, the room was packed. It was standing room only, and we didn't know what to expect. And I think one of the things this project did for our readership at the Texas Tribune was we had a ton of readership in Houston for this project. And that's pretty unusual. I think we've really been trying to expand our readership outside of Austin, and this was one of the first big successes. So that was a great sign. I think also, we had this project on 3 different platforms. There was ProPublica and Texas Tribune. It was basically the same website. Then we had a podcast on Reveal, and that's, again, a totally different audience. So it was very important to us to get it out to different audiences. A lot of other folks picked up the text. I think The Atlantic just published they just published all 5 stories in a row on their page, on one page. Same thing with Boomtown, Floodtown. Scientific American, I think, put it on their website. And so we really do try to distribute our content far and wide. So we thought a lot about that when we did this project.
And so you got a quick reaction out of the state legislature. I'm curious about that because the timing, Texas's state legislature meets every odd-numbered year in the spring for a few months. So you were kind of far from a typical window of opportunity there.
Yes, I think that we like to do projects at the Tribune that come out during the session. But if we wanted to do that this time, we would have had to wait another year, and that didn't make any sense. This is also really a project that's also heavily focused on something that would involve federal funding and federal action. So I think we didn't feel, there are other projects where we would really want it to come out before the session because it is so state legislature. I mean, they would be the ones to deal with it, and I think this one actually was a little different in that respect. But you know, another thing that I think is really important to mention is these scientific models, they weren't just about the storms, they also looked at what potential solutions might do. And they looked at what how the impact would change if you had something like the coastal spine in place, and we showed a couple of different versions of that. And so it was great that, you know, we could put those in there, or we could show you how the damage would be different, and that's something Jeff and Al were able to accomplish in the application.
So, Cheryl, I wanted to talk a little bit about this genre, if you could call it that, of like prophetic journalism. You know, both Hell and High Water and then the Boomtown Floodtown story. You were involved in a report that it came to mind. The Seattle Times in 2010 won the Knight-Risser Prize. Always comes back to Knight-Risser Prize. In 2010 for a project called Logging and Landslides.
Yes.
Can you tell me about that report and what happened in the years to come after that?
So that particular project came about because we had Seattle always has a lot of rainfall, but had even more rainfall than normal, as did the entire state. And Interstate 5 ended up flooding between Portland and Seattle. I think it was flooded for several days. And an entire mountain basically kind of had a mudslide. And the photographer went out on a helicopter to take pictures of like the flooding, and they ended up swinging by this mountain, and he took this photo. His name was Steve Ringman, and he came down here to talk when we won the Knight-Risser, and we ended up calling that Mount Ringman because he took this picture, which we ran on the front page, and it showed this massive mudslide as a result of the flooding. But what was clear was that the mountain had been heavily logged, and so then myself and another data journalist at the paper, Justin Mayo, decided that we needed to go after the logging permits. Like, we needed to look and see what was going on with logging. And so we requested all the logging permits, which were all on paper, hand-entered the data, and I ended up being one of the editors for this project. And so Justin and Hal Burnton, who's an environmental reporter, and then Steve Ringman, the photographer, actually thinking about collaboration. This is like collaboration begins kind of within the newsroom across departments. And so the reporter, the data reporter, the kind of shoe leather reporter, and the photographer all went out together all the time on all of the reporting for this project. So they, you know, waded through mud and all kinds of things. They all went and met with professors, speaking about mapping data that sometimes can be hidden in maybe open but yet hard to find archival information. The University of Washington had all of these models showing slope instability. And we built an interactive. At the time it was in Flash, because that's what people did back then. And so it's not in existence anymore because that just doesn't exist. But we were able to show that what happened was the logging companies basically rubber stamped their own permits and got approval to log, and they would submit these reports saying that the instability was not that bad. And in fact, all of their own reports showed that the instability was very high, and we were able to show that because of this University of Washington data. And then, I guess, fast forward to 2014, and there was another landslide, the Oso landslide, which killed 43 people. So as a result of our project, the Logging and Landslides project, the legislature did act, and it sharply curtailed the way that logging permits could be approved. Those were logging permits. And so, prescient to a point, right, prophetic to a point, we as journalists didn't think about, like, well, what other things are happening near areas that have been logged. And so this small community was right below a slope that had warnings had been going on for decades about problems with, there had been a lot of logging and a lot of other, and it was just an unstable slope. And yet the developers wanted, it was on a river, developers wanted to build houses, they wanted to sell land, and so they were able to. And as a result, this entire side of the hill collapsed onto this neighborhood, and 43 people died. And then Ken Armstrong, who's now at ProPublica, actually, when we were working on the reporting for that, he he found a source who had been with the state and had kept boxes of information showing all of these warnings going back, and we built an interactive kind of showing this timeline of how the state had ignored all these warnings. And there's been action, policy, changes in policy and regulation since then. But so prophetic, but probably not prophetic enough, I guess. Yeah.
David Hayes, government also doesn't just react to journalistic reports. Also, there's a lot of studies that get done and research. You know something about both reacting to disasters, such as the Deepwater Horizon oil spill that you were involved in addressing, and you've also worked to anticipate threats like the climate adaptation plans that you worked on with the Obama administration. And I understand you were involved in developing a rule saying that federally funded projects had to be designed with sea level rise in mind. Can you tell me about that rule and what's happened since and what your thoughts are about the federal response to Harvey?
Sure. So I was in the administration when Hurricane Sandy hit, and a lot of aspects of that are relevant here, including the development of some terrific mapping coming out of that. The USGS, part of the Interior Department, did some LiDAR mapping that showed some of the impacts in a dramatic way. And then there was a lot of money, $400 million sent to our department to do resilience planning going forward. And a lot of attention and a very, very successful interagency effort, actually, that Sean Donovan led from HUD to plan going forward for how to rebuild. And it was a dramatic hit. There were a lot of assets of the Interior Department, for example. The Statue of Liberty was flooded out, and New York, and then the refuges along the New Jersey coast were destroyed. Also, lots of lessons about the advantages of green infrastructure and the ability to reduce the severity of the storm surge with coastal marshes and sort of natural green infrastructure. So lots of lessons. But one of the things that came out of it was a very thoughtful, I think, federal process that when we rebuild, and when we rebuilt Liberty Island, for example, maybe we're not going to put the electricity underground. Maybe we should think about rebuilding in a different way. And actually, the National Park Service runs across this all the time. The Satija park unit, the parking lot is gone because of erosion, and we had to move the lighthouse at Cape Hatteras because of erosion. So the federal government has seen this coming, and it led to an executive order that President Obama issued setting a new flood standard that essentially requires that when FEMA spends money post-disaster, to rebuild not to the previous standard, but to rebuild to a standard that takes into account climate change impacts. So take into account the sea rise, et cetera. And a rulemaking was begun in that regard at the Department of Homeland Security and an administrative record was developed to support that standard. That did not become finalized before the Trump administration came in. And then about a week or two before Harvey hit, President Trump issued his own executive order, ironically, on how to speed up the building of new infrastructure, and he nullified the flood standard because he said that takes away our ability to build infrastructure more quickly. So we haven't learned our lessons, I would say.
Thanks for that, and I'm sorry.
We're all sorry, Jeff.
So, Jeff, I want to come back to the idea that this is an amazing work of journalism, but it's more than just the work of journalists. We're using these models that were developed at state and private universities in Texas. And those models were created by a legislative initiative after Hurricane Ike, right? That they created this hurricane center, or at least one of them. And this was because of the sort of near miss by Ike in 2008, although it was, is this right? It killed 74 people and caused $30 billion in damage. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
That's some near miss. What you're doing, in a sense, is you're clarifying and amplifying a signal that has, knowledge that has been gathered, but maybe isn't going anywhere. What do you think is sort of the relationship between this kind of science and publicly funded science and what journalists can do?
Well, yeah, I'll say the legislature, I believe after Ike, created what is called the Speed Center, and I can never remember what it stands for. It's 2 S's and speed, and but it's a center that it looks at hurricane preparedness. Really, it's based at Rice University. I don't think they actually funded it, but they created it. Maybe put in a little bit of funding. But really, in fact, the Rice University model that we use, the Speed Center model, was not was actually created with private money. The Speed Center is mostly privately funded, which is interesting. But that's, I think they had this conference 5 years after Ike. I was there, and I really wanted to connect with these scientists, and ultimately, I think that was a huge reason we ended up being aware this data existed and wanting to work with it.
Well, the scientists also, they're two competing groups
Right,
of scientists.
so that's one of those.
One of which calls the other climate change deniers, and it's like there's a lot of infighting within. I would say, just from my perspective, actually working with the data, once you figure it out, it's a really nice file format, but like there's no documentation for a lay person to be able to do this, right? Or someone who doesn't have a PhD. And also they're sort of reluctant to talk to us to begin with, right? Because we haven't put in the time. And I think at a very basic level, just getting this information out. You mentioned the USGS. The USGS has and NASA both have great programs for providing data to industry, to journalists. They provide training on all of this sort of stuff. The storm weather models that are more complicated than what NOAA does, nobody gets to see. They sit on academic hard drives that we have to buy plane tickets to go and get access to. And this is increasingly a problem, when we're trying to tell these prophetic stories, because that's our best guess of what is going to happen, right? There are two academic groups, one who just moves Ike over to where it was supposed to land, and another one that does averages, and they're currently fighting, and they don't want to release their data to anybody unless you're Al Shah, right, the kid from Brooklyn, who spends the months in time necessary to understand it. But in terms of scientific debate, it's enough to publish a paper, sure, and get it peer reviewed and everything like that. But publishing the actual underlying data, even if it's only meant to be run on supercomputers, could be a boon. If we had these models for Puerto Rico, right, or if we had these models for every time a hurricane hits land, someone probably could have written, a hell and high water, right? If they had access to that data, right? These are things that are not necessarily unknown, right? They're known that they are risks. It's just the amount of accessibility into this very, very niche world is almost zero. And so raising the public awareness and demanding more of that data to be published, as the USGS has done with Landsat and things like that, is something that would behoove us all.
I really think, too, that just this idea that scientists and journalists can be more in touch, that there isn't I don't see a conflict of interest in working more with scientists or scientists working more with journalists to make sure their work gets out there. You still have a rigorous review process. These are all peer-reviewed papers. And in fact, my colleagues at Reveal at the Center for Investigative Reporting are pursuing this. They've got a grant to do more direct work with scientists. So I really think that it's interesting, when we first contacted the Speed Center and talked to the scientists there, one of them said, what is ProPublica? And
well, to be fair, my mom thought I worked for Politico for 2 years, so.
That's hilarious. But I think there should be, they knew the Texas Tribune, so that was good. They were at Rice, but there should be more communication. That should, and now, of course, one of the scientists in the other group wants to give Al Shaw an honorary PhD. So, they've changed their tune. But it really, I think having more of a relationship and building some more trust is a huge part of this. There's just so much research out there that I think scientists would like to have be more accessible. And I really think that these particular scientists we work with think a lot more about that now than they did before.
Certainly. They wrote a blog post afterwards saying it was like the greatest thing ever. We've been working with them for a year, and it really was. I mean, I can gripe and complain, but, they did ultimately help us out with understanding what was going on, pointing us to the right documentation to be able to write this code. It just should be, from my perspective, should be easier. We should have these kind of stories cropping up around coastal cities all the time.
Well, Cheryl, you're sort of the collaboration guru with the Computational Journalism Lab and your collaborations and co-ops. What do you think is the key to sort of helping this stuff kind of scale to more than just individual projects?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think Jeff's point is really important, that there's a lot of information, maybe models or data out there, especially academic institutions, that could be shared. A lot of times I also find that academic researchers don't have data, but they would, if they had the data, they would be very interested in exploring and analyzing it and doing some really sophisticated analysis. So one particular project I did when I first got here was I had my students go after some public data on police interactions. So state patrols stop people, sometimes they search them, sometimes they ticket them, and there's always questions about what are the racial disparities going on there. I had done that project when I worked at the Seattle Times. I'd done it with Washington state data. I sent my students out to see how many other states we could get worth of data. So, 2 years later, we have 130 million records. And more importantly, I connected with an assistant professor in engineering, Shard Goel, who had done stop and frisk analysis in New York by the New York police, and really done a lot of, that's what he does, is applied mathematics and statistics, and he focuses on disparities and discrimination. So from my perspective as a journalist, I can run a regression analysis and I can do statistics, but I am not a statistician. And even when I, do those kinds of more sophisticated work, I usually go find myself an academic to say, did I do this correctly? Am I missing something? And so I was fortunate in that I met up with Shard, and he was fortunate in that I had data. And so, we both, our eyes probably lit up, and we decided to create this collaborative project. But to Jeff's point, I think in particular, what was important to me was that all of this data is hard to get. And we could have kept it and collaborated and done some big academic paper out of it, and that would have been all well and good, and it would not have had nearly the impact. But what we did was we processed the data, we made it easy to access, we provided it for download on our site, we provided visualizations of what the data the findings look like, and tutorials for journalists and researchers on how to analyze the data. And then we went out and did workshops where we trained journalists to use, to really take a look at this data. And I think as a result, probably the academics also learned a little bit about what journalism was about and how could we tell the story in a way that would get impact. And so I think both things can be true, and academics can use it for their purpose, and journalists can use it for their purpose, and they can share in the middle. And I think that's really important, and it's a great opportunity right now.
That's interesting. I think that in parallel to the types of social science data that you're collecting, maybe some of them from local governments or state governments, there's the hard science data that's coming from remote sensing from satellites and airplanes and various instruments. And I think about how ProPublica has done a lot, and I think investigative reporters and editors also in helping people work with Landsat information, which is much more accessible than it had been in recent years. But this also points back to...
Let me add one thing. So we can also work with industry. So Esri, which does a lot of mapping, will provide satellite imagery to journalists all the time. In fact, they did that with the Oso landslide for us at the Seattle Times. So another example.
Yeah, well, and I was going to say that this points back somewhat to the federal government and the agencies like USGS, NOAA, NASA, that have done so much to give us that kind of data. And I know that things could be changing. There have been talk of deep cuts, and there's some satellites that are, shuffling off their operational lifespan. But David, I know that we'd had conversations where you talked about how interested you were in making even greater use of mapping and both for decision making and analysis, but also for maybe more public presentations. Do you think there's a role that the government or public agencies could take in doing these kinds of presentations as well? Or where do you draw the line?
It's huge. I mean, the coolest thing about your project is the mapping, and the visualization just brings this alive in a way that the print cannot. So when I was in the Clinton administration with Bruce Babbitt, Bruce is a geek, and he loved USGS, and there's a intergovernmental organization that works on the data capability across the government. USGS is the chair of it, and the Secretary of the Interior showed up as the chair of this interagency group. It had been lower level folks, but Bruce got involved. And showed some of the capabilities for decision makers of how good data and good visualization can help. Interior Department's the largest landowner in the United States, 550 million acres. You're making decisions. How can you do it without good maps? And of course, USGS did the maps in the old-fashioned way. Now they're doing this, and it was in the Obama administration that Landsat was made public. Marcia McNutt, head of the USGS, made that announcement. I went to Beijing as the head of a U.S. delegation among all the countries that share the global positioning data. The government is the logical place to bring together the data and make it available for free, which is what the U.S. government led, and now Germany and South Africa, many other countries are adding to it. And just in terms of making better decisions, having visualization, and it's important for investigative journalism, it's important for advocacy when we're making a decision about whether to protect Teshupuk Lake in the Arctic and the National Petroleum Reserve. The Audubon Society came in with fabulous data and mapping showing that the songbirds we're all looking at as they migrate through go up, and guess where they winter? They winter in Teshupuk Lake. This is not an abstract question about whether we should protect that place. So one of the real issues, though, in addition to in terms of this whole tableau, is the government needs to do a better job of translating the data that it has into metadata that is easily accessible and mappable. And there's a real missed opportunity, I think, with all the scientists, the government scientists, whether it's biologists or geologists or whatever, they have valuable data, but they don't make it available in easily GIS coordinated fashion. So I'm confident, though, with Google Earth and everything else and your good work, that folks are starting to expect to be able to see a story unfold in this way. And that will, I hope, push the government to continue to invest in this area. And Jack Dangerman at Esri has been I think, done a real public service while making a lot of money too, but to provide platforms that make it easy for folks to themselves manipulate data and tell stories that otherwise aren't available.
Well, so what do we think? Like, are there some opportunities to sort of take this kind of work and make it more reproducible? I know it's very, very difficult to do this kind of storm modeling stuff, and what you had to go up against to tackle that is that you came up with a new file format, right? The .jef file.
Yeah, that was for a project we did on
Yeah.
Sandy, and I couldn't figure out what to call it, so I just called it the Jeff files.
Some people call it a .gef, but that's a
right,
nerd
exactly.
joke. Sorry.
But I think so. I mean, as a news organization, we have open sourced a whole slate of tools for dealing with GIS formats that we run up against online that anybody can download. You know, the stuff that we're talking about here is at the very edges. I think we are seeing, since Landsat and things like GIS products have sort of been increasingly open sourced by the government and downloaded royalty free, we are seeing an explosion of work in this area, and the tooling is better than anything else. But I still think that we have a whole ton of work to do, especially when we're talking about predictive modeling and the warning signs that we're missing right now, that are happening again and again and again. And some of that is government, some of that is, the journalists not having the tools, some of that is academics reluctant to talk to anybody else. And I just think we could do a much better job of having one of these a month instead of one or two of these a year.
I just want to quickly add that I think it's also about thinking about new ways of telling this story in whatever community you're in, and that for us it was obviously a huge part of that was this mapping. It was the show, the Reveal podcast. We know of other examples of the New Yorker story on earthquakes, which was, the Seattle Times had already done that story, to be fair. But I think a lot of it was also looking at how can you tell this story? Can you do it in a literary way? Can you do it, how do you get people to connect with it and not just have it be there's this big thing that will happen where thousands of people will die? Can you go to areas we know will be affected, and that's why the science is so important to have? Can you go to specific areas where you know X amount of water might be there and talk to the people about that? How specific, how much can you drill down? I think people don't realize they can do that and that there is science that can help them do that. So just getting to that part is important too.
And I think we particularly have a problem with local data. I mean, it may be getting easier to get data on the federal level, but local data is inconsistent and really difficult to process and then be able to aggregate up and use. So I think there's an opportunity there.
Any last words before we turn it over to questions, or should we? Okay, well, why don't we, we've got about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. So just raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. I think we have between 1 and 2 microphones, I believe. We have 1 mic, okay.
Hi, Houston native here.
Nice.
I'm so excited. I read y'all's piece in ProPublica, and one part that I thought was really interesting was the piece about flood maps, kind of how maybe political decision makers get involved in the scientific drawing of flood maps and how that governs where people build and how they build and how cheaply. And I was wondering if you could kind of expound on that and what's kind of the narrative for how we should be thinking about how flood maps are currently designed and maybe what's the best way to design flood maps for an area.
Wow, great question. Really big deal right now.
That'll be next year's symposium.
Yeah. I mean, Neena knows a lot about it in Texas, and I can tell you stories in New York.
I think it is absolutely political. One other real issue right now is that the flood maps are, our definition of a 100-year storm is almost surely inaccurate. Houston, the Harris County Flood Control District is, a local entity that deals a lot with flooding issues in the Houston area. They are participating in a study called the Atlas 14, which is a NOAA study, which is hopefully going to answer the question of what is the new 100-year storm. I'm very curious to see what they'll come up with in terms of what the rainfall total should be. So that's going to have a huge impact. So we know the maps are wrong, I think, just from that standpoint. And the other, my rudimentary understanding of it is they also don't capture this issue of urban flooding. So, why are people flooding that don't live along the bayou and along the river? There's all sorts of issues there. And so I think the maps are they're completely wrong.
Yeah, in New York, after Sandy, Al and I sort of looked into it a little bit, and the flood maps in Brooklyn, I think, were drawn in the 70s. Flood maps in Long Island were drawn in the 90s. And you have sort of this mismatch. You have different eras of science defining what is going to flood, right? And then you also definitely have a political sort of angle to it. Every time you draw a flood map, someone's flood insurance rates are going to go up, right? So you have this sort of all of a sudden, hey, this area is going to flood. You have a bunch of mad homeowners who are paying more for flood insurance or less for flood insurance if they live within a FEMA-covered area, right? So the flood maps themselves are we found sort of not very good predictors on a large scale of the edges of the flooding, right? So the places where there's certainly areas near the coast that are definitely going to flood no matter what a flood map's going to say, and everybody knows that. But as you go further in, they don't take into account building effects. You have this whole sort of mad homeowner sort of effect. And you also have the fact that, you know, some flood maps are made with LiDAR, right? And some flood maps haven't been updated since like the 1970s.
And LiDAR is taking land elevation into account and things like that, right?
Yeah, it's shooting lasers at the ground from planes.
Or
which is
looking
the
at
coolest
logging
thing.
and, what are the impacts of logging?
Yeah, what are the
Like that.
impacts
None
of
of the
logging?
flood maps
Yeah.
in the Washington area looked at the impact of logging.
Actually, I was talking to an official about this recently, and he was saying, you know, also, the whole Houston area is sinking. It has been for a long time. That has slowed for lots of different reasons, but, you know, not all that's being taken into account either. They're not updating these maps every year for those. So really, they're wrong. If you have any family that still lives in Houston, please make sure they have flood insurance, no matter where they live. But this is going to be a huge discussion. I think most officials in Houston recognize the maps are wrong. I think they're terrified of what they actually are. You know,
I think we could take a moment to just remember how glad we are that the hurricane didn't hit the ship channel or the petrochemical complex. You know,
If I can just quickly jump in, I think the potential solution here, it's a tough one, but it's going to come from the fact that these incidents are more and more expensive. And you're already seeing a debate right now, literally right now in the Congress, about flood insurance, because you have these situations where folks just rebuild, and we are not good in our country in terms of being willing to invest what we need to invest in our infrastructure. Well, that's traditional. Now we're going to have these. We are seeing these huge new infrastructure type costs coming from directly from the impacts of climate change, and the fiscal implications of that are huge. So I think we're going to have to see. There's no profile in courage with local politicians when it comes to flood maps, but whoever is in charge of the fisc is going to have a say in this inevitably.
Hi, I'm interested in the collaboration between Chicago Tribune and ProPublica. You know, especially when media organizations trying to fight for exclusiveness, exclusive stories and sources, and how did you see that such collaboration or intermedia collaboration can become more widespread in the future? And then what are some of the recipes for successful collaboration between different media organizations?
yeah. So I think it is becoming more. I think it's becoming a lot more widespread. I mean, I think you know, you all partner with.
Yeah, we do it. I mean, we do it
almost
all the
every
time.
time.
It's basically what we do. Because specifically because of this reason, right? We have Al and I in New York, right, who know how to do like the programming and stuff, but like we barely have command of English, and we have great reporters who are on the ground who can find sources, right? And we recognize that, right? We recognize that we're, you know, in New York, we don't have a lot of reach outside of New York. We have a very small office in DC and a little bit in San Francisco. So we've always been collaborators. We'd like to hear from Neena on whether or not she found that hanging out with us was promising or not.
I mean, yeah, I absolutely think. I think it was a combination of a lot of things, but I also think it was key, like Jeff said, that we had different things to bring to the table. You know, that it wasn't just a national and a local. And it wasn't even just that they were in New York and we were in Houston. Although, I mean, we were in Austin and could go to Houston easily, but that we had different sets of skills. And I think that's it. I think that's when collaboration succeeds the most.
Right, but what if you two don't personally know each other before this collaboration taking place?
Yeah, we didn't know each other.
No.
Oh, you didn't?
Yeah, I'd never
Okay.
met Jeff or Al or Scott, their editor. I think at one point they did, at least Al did come down to Austin a
Yeah.
couple times. I mean, we did try to get some FaceTime. That was important. It was a lot of electronic communication. And I think it's, you know, for those kinds of things require really good editors and leaders to facilitate that communication, to be willing to talk to each other, to get the reporters in the room together. You need that. I think if we didn't have editors that wanted to work together and were excited to work together, this would not have happened. It would not have been a success. So you really need leadership too.
I'll just add from the perspective of having collaborated when I was at the Seattle Times with ProPublica on a project on foreclosures, and yet you do have to have the editors on the same kind of page and really working very closely, because frankly, collaboration takes more work. It's harder to do, but I think the payoff can be greater. And so that's the motivating factor. And I think there is a lot of interest in collaboration. I routinely collaborate with news organizations with my students, where we provide shoe leather and data analysis or video or whatever, and then they provide something else, right? Whichever the news entity might be. So.
Yeah, I should add that Cheryl made a good point when I asked in a conversation before the event. Is it strange for journalists to set aside their competitiveness and collaborate like this? Is it against the nature? And I think you said something like, I'm quoting you here,
Okay.
Journalism organizations don't need to compete on the quality of their file formats.
Right, yeah.
Oh,
So the thing that we noticed with our open policing project was, or even the Civic Data Coalition, where we're getting the campaign finance data from the state of California, which is in horrible shape, and we're basically just processing it, cleaning it up, so it's easier for journalists to get the data. Then they can go do their stories if they want to, and they can be different stories. But I mean, why should we compete on that? That doesn't make sense. We should share on that, and so that we can move stories forward.
You know, and I've sort of slept through this point. I forgot that being at the Bill Lane Center for the American West, we're very interested in regional journalism about the West and about backfilling, journalism that's an industry that's had problems and has lost a lot of good reporters. How can we bolster the efforts by enlisting resources from academic institutions, from nonprofits, from smaller local institutions that could do well to team up with bigger organizations? And so we do that through our media fellowships and also through projects that we work on. And I think that there is, I don't know that there's a huge movement of this, but I think there's the seedlings of this kind of pro-am.
Well, I think one thing with the Open Policing Project is now we have journalists from all over the country, small shops, and they'll reach out to us and say, oh, we downloaded our data. Let's say, for example, Massachusetts just published, the television station near Boston just published using the State Patrol data. And then they ran by there and, like, here's what we did, here's the analysis that we did. Are we missing something big? Did we screw something up? Can you just give us a little guidance? And that's really helpful. They don't necessarily have the resources to be able to do that otherwise.
I think at this point, we should all be working together when we can. I mean, and this is the current era of journalism and, the current administration. I think for as long as I've been in journalism, there have not been enough journalists, there haven't been enough bodies, there hasn't been enough manpower, and so it really, really makes me mad when people don't want to collaborate out of competition. I mean, I certainly think there are times when competition is good for journalism, and I don't think we should all be one big newsroom, but I do really feel that we're at a point now where we don't have enough people, and so we need to think more about collaboration and worry less about that.
I think we've got time for one little last question.
It's very quickly. Actually, it wasn't my time, but I asked it because I have another question about collaboration. When did you start, or the two teams started trusting each other? Exactly when did you see that, okay, I trust my competitor?
I don't think that ever happened. No. I think it was pretty much from our end, pretty much right off the bat. Mostly because, we needed these guys, right? Al and I can make like a beautiful graph with like 100 words on it, or a beautiful map with 100 words on it. But we really, really needed a narrative to like build out, to bolster what this entire story actually is, and to help shape the project with local knowledge.
And I think, one of the things that made it easier and makes it easier with my joint job with the Texas Tribune and Reveal is we're all nonprofit. We're all kind of serving the public interest. I think we're competitive in some ways, but in other ways we're more willing to collaborate. That's the spirit of our organization. So it can be hard. We've partnered with newspapers, and that's also worked out really well. But I think this is one where from the start we had I use the word spirit. Like, our organizations have that same spirit and attitude of how to work together, collaboration, of sharing our work elsewhere for free. Whoever wants to publish it can publish it. So I think that understanding was from the get-go, and it's important to have that. It's hard it's hard if you don't, and if you're not sure, then it's important to have that discussion really early on about how to foster that and how to trust each other. But we had to share everything from the start.
And we have a final question from the man who kicked it off.
Yeah,
David Kennedy.
thanks, Jeff. I recognize that what I'm about to ask you may be asking you for information that's redundant for a lot of people in this room, but I think not for everybody. The question is addressed to you, Jeff. Can you just tell us a little, it's on this note of collaboration and new institutional architectures in the whole field of journalism. Can you just tell us a little something about the history, character, and mission of ProPublica?
Yeah, so we were founded after the 2008 financial crisis to sort of be, to strive to be America's largest investigative newsroom. So built into our bread and built into our blood is this idea of collaboration. We don't often, while we see ourselves as a national news organization, we still have like a weird Latin name, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people don't really look at us. But what we do provide is we provide smaller newsrooms around the country, the sort of investigative muscle that we can bring. So from the very get-go, we've built in this idea of partnerships with other people, and we've partnered with everybody from the New York Times to smaller outlets around the regional outlets like the St. Pete Times, all around the country. I think we have hundreds of partners now listed on our website, not only nationally but also in Europe and South America, and that's really, really what we do. And we've been doing it for almost a decade. So at this point, the collaboration question is pretty much settled, right? We try and do the same thing that Neena was saying, which is we play to our strengths and we look for partners that have strengths that complement ours, which is what we've been doing for a long time.
Okay, well, thank you all so much, and thank you to the panel, to Neena, Jeff, Cheryl, David. Congratulations to you both and to the rest of your team. And everybody, think about checking out the Reveal podcast version of this. It's a very fine program in general, Reveal's work. And this event will be televised. We have recorded this, and it is my duty to edit myself, which is, nobody should ever have to do that. Hi, me.
So it's all going to be you. It's
yeah.
going to be an hour of you. Okay.
So anyway, thank you all so much.